The ocean was so close beneath the P-38s that one bad movement of the control stick could have turned the entire mission into wreckage before the Japanese ever saw them coming. For more than 2 hours, the American fighters skimmed the Pacific at wave-top height, engines low and steady, radios silent, fuel draining from external tanks they could not afford to waste. Somewhere ahead, beyond hundreds of miles of empty water and jungle-covered islands, one Japanese aircraft was supposed to appear at exactly the right minute. Not 10 minutes early, not 10 minutes late, exactly on time. If the Americans arrived too soon, they would circle over enemy territory and burn fuel they did not have. If they arrived too late, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would land safely at Balale, vanish behind Japanese defenses, and the most precise aerial ambush of the Pacific War would become nothing but 18 fighters staring at an empty sky. Major John Mitchell had planned the interception with a coldness that looked almost impossible on paper. The route had to avoid Japanese observers. The altitude had to stay low enough to hide the aircraft from detection. The pilots had to maintain radio silence. The P-38s had to carry enough fuel to reach the target, fight, and return across the same ocean that would swallow any mistake. And when they finally reached Bougainville, they had to find a moving aircraft in the vastness of the Pacific sky at the one moment when history gave them a chance. Then, near the coast, the impossible happened. Through the haze above Bougainville, the American pilots saw them two Japanese Betty bombers, exactly where intelligence said they would be, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Inside one of those bombers was the man who had planned the strike that brought America into the Pacific War, a man so important to Japan that his death could not simply be called a combat loss. It would be a shock to an empire. The P-38s dropped their external tanks and climbed. The hunt had found its target. Welcome to WingsOfWaar. If you love stories where aircraft, intelligence, timing, and impossible decisions collide in the sky, subscribe to the channel right now. And before we go deeper, write in the comments, was Operation Vengeance a legitimate act of war against a military commander, or did targeting one specific man cross a line? I want to know what you think, because this story is not just about a dogfight. It is about a secret message, a mathematical ambush, and the moment when revenge became a flight plan. To understand why the Americans were willing to send P-38s hundreds of miles across the Pacific to intercept one aircraft, you have to go back to the morning that burned itself into American memory, Pearl Harbor. For the United States, December 7th, 1941 was not simply an attack. It was a wound, a humiliation, and a declaration that the Pacific War would not be fought according to the comfortable assumptions Americans had carried before that morning. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, thousands of men were killed or wounded. The United States, which had been arguing with itself about war, was suddenly inside one. And behind that attack stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was not a cartoon villain. That would make the story weaker. Yamamoto was far more dangerous than that. He was intelligent, educated, disciplined, and deeply experienced. He had spent time in the United States, understood American industry better than many of his colleagues, and warned that Japan could not win a long industrial war against America if the conflict dragged on. But he was also the commander who planned the strike against Pearl Harbor, the commander whose carriers crossed the Pacific and delivered the blow that changed everything. That complexity made him one of the most important men in the Japanese military. He was admired inside Japan, respected by many of his enemies, and feared because he understood naval aviation at a time when battleship-minded officers were still trying to catch up with the future. Yamamoto had helped prove that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would decide the shape of the Pacific War. By 1943, that made him more than a commander. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power and one of the few men whose presence could still inspire confidence after the disaster at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal had been a brutal lesson for Japan. The campaign consumed ships, aircraft, supplies, and trained men at a rate the empire could not easily replace. The evacuation of Japanese forces from the island was a severe blow, not only militarily, but psychologically. Japanese air units in the Solomons had suffered, and morale needed repair. Yamamoto planned an inspection tour to visit forward bases, encourage pilots and crews, and show that the high command had not forgotten them. That decision created the opening. On April 14, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted a Japanese message containing Yamamoto's itinerary. It was the kind of intelligence officers dream about and commanders fear using too obviously. The message gave times, destinations, aircraft, escort details, and the route of one of Japan's most important military leaders. It was not vague. It was not a rumor. It was a schedule. Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul toward Balale near Bougainville. He would travel in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, accompanied by another Betty carrying staff officers, with 6 Zero fighters as escort. He was known for punctuality, and the Japanese expected the flight to run on time. For the Americans, this presented a problem that was both simple and dangerous. They knew where Yamamoto would be, but could they reach him? The distance was enormous for fighter aircraft. Navy and Marine fighters in the area did not have the range to fly the mission and return safely. The aircraft that could do it was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter with long legs, concentrated nose firepower, and the ability to carry external fuel tanks. It was not just another fighter. For this mission, it was the only practical answer. The P-38 looked different from almost everything else in the sky. 2 long booms stretched back from the engines to twin tails. Between them sat a central cockpit pod with guns clustered in the nose. That arrangement gave the Lightning a powerful advantage. Its weapons did not need to be synchronized through a spinning propeller, and its fire did not converge from wide wings the way many other fighters did. The guns pointed straight ahead from the centerline, making the aircraft brutally accurate when the pilot put the target in front of him. For Operation Vengeance, that mattered. There would be no long battle if the plan worked. The Americans needed a brief interception, a violent few seconds, and then a return flight across hundreds of miles of ocean. The P-38 had to be hunter, executioner, and survivor in the same mission. But even with the Lightning, the mission was still near the edge of what was possible. The pilots would need external fuel tanks. They would need exact navigation over water. They would need to fly low, because if Japanese Coast Watchers' radar or observers detected them too early, the whole operation could be ruined. They would need radio silence because chatter could give them away, and they would need to arrive at the interception point at almost the exact moment Yamamoto's aircraft appeared. This was not a mission built on strength alone. It was built on mathematics. Speed, distance, fuel, wind, heading, altitude, timing. Every number mattered. Major John Mitchell was given command of the mission, and the planning became almost surgical. The pilots would not fly directly toward the target in a simple straight line. They would take a circuitous route, staying low over the water to avoid detection and approaching Bougainville from a direction the Japanese would not expect. The route had to be long enough to hide them, but short enough to leave fuel for the fight and return. It was the kind of plan where bravery alone could not save a mistake. 18 P-38s were assigned. Some would serve as spares in case aircraft had mechanical trouble at takeoff or during the early part of the mission. 4 aircraft were designated as the attack section, the group that would go after the bombers. The others would provide top cover, climbing to engage the Zero escorts and protect the attackers during the critical seconds over Bougainville. The men who climbed into those cockpits knew the mission was unusual, even if not every detail was explained in the same way to every pilot. They knew the target was important. They knew the route was dangerous. They knew the distance alone could kill them without a single enemy bullet. The P-38 was capable, but it was still an aircraft, not a miracle. Fuel gauges did not care about patriotism. Engines did not care about revenge. Navigation errors did not forgive famous targets. On the morning of April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid had struck Japan, the P-38s took off from Guadalcanal. That detail feels almost too cinematic, but history sometimes arranges its own symbols. 1 year earlier, American bombers had launched from an aircraft carrier to strike Japan itself, proving that the home islands were not untouchable. Now, 1 year later, American fighters were lifting off to intercept the architect of Pearl Harbor in the skies over Bougainville. The first danger came almost immediately, not from the Japanese, but from the aircraft themselves. Long-range missions are unforgiving, and mechanical problems appeared early. One pilot had tire trouble, another had trouble with fuel tanks. Aircraft that could not complete the mission had to drop out, and spares had to take their place. This was exactly why spares had been included, but every change added stress. The mission had barely begun, and already it was reminding the pilots that plans are clean only before engines start. Once the force settled into the route, the P-38s dropped low over the water. This is one of the strongest images in the entire story, American fighters flying so low across the Pacific that the ocean itself became part of the mission. They were not high above the world like knights in the sky. They were down near the surface, hidden in the glare and haze, trying to slip past the Japanese-held islands without being seen. The pilots had to hold formation, maintain heading, watch fuel, avoid climbing, and say nothing over the radio. For more than 2 hours, the mission was not a battle. It was discipline. There is a special kind of tension in radio silence. A pilot cannot easily ask questions. He cannot complain about fuel. He cannot confirm every doubt. He has to trust the leader, the compass, the calculations, and the men around him. Each cockpit becomes its own small world of engine vibration, instrument needles, sweat, and restraint. The pilots were not fighting yet, but every minute demanded control. Imagine what Mitchell carried in his mind during that flight. He had to lead the formation across open water using timing and dead reckoning with extraordinary precision. If he drifted off course, they might miss the target completely. If the speed was wrong, the timing would collapse. If the formation climbed too early, it might be seen. If it stayed too low too long, the climb to intercept might become rushed. And behind all of that was the knowledge that the mission had been born from a priceless intelligence secret. That secret was another danger. The Americans could not simply reveal to the world that they had read Yamamoto's itinerary from Japanese coded communications. If the Japanese realized their naval codes had been compromised, they might change systems, close the window of intelligence, and blind American codebreakers in the middle of the Pacific War. The pilots needed a cover story. The operation had to look as if it might have been guided by coast watchers or ordinary reconnaissance, not by the breaking of Japanese messages. So Operation Vengeance had two missions at once: shoot down Yamamoto and protect the secret that made the ambush possible, that made the stakes even higher. If the mission succeeded too perfectly, if the details leaked too quickly, the Japanese might ask how the Americans had known exactly when and where to be waiting. The operation had to be bold in the air and quiet afterward. That is a difficult combination for men who risk their lives and then return with a story no one is supposed to tell. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's flight was proceeding as scheduled. This is one of the remarkable details of the operation. The entire ambush depended on Yamamoto being punctual, and he was. His aircraft departed according to plan. The two Betty bombers flew toward Bougainville with their Zero escort. From the Japanese perspective, this was an inspection flight by a senior commander in a dangerous but controlled theater. They knew the risk of flying near the front, but they did not know that American fighters were already moving across the ocean toward the same point in space. The Mitsubishi Betty was a long-range bomber valued by Japan for its reach across the vast distances of the Pacific, but that range came with trade-offs. Like many Japanese aircraft, it emphasized lightness and endurance over protection. It did not have the same level of armor and self-sealing fuel protection found in many American aircraft. Allied pilots knew the Betty could be vulnerable when hit, especially by concentrated fire. Against a P-38's nose guns, that vulnerability mattered. Still, the Betty was not flying alone. 6 Zeros escorted the formation, and the Zero was still a dangerous fighter in the hands of a capable pilot. It was agile, responsive, and deadly if allowed to pull an opponent into a turning fight. The American pilots could not simply charge in and expect an easy kill. If the Zeros reacted quickly, the attack section could be dragged away from the bombers or destroyed before finishing the mission. Everything depended on surprise, timing, and division of roles. As the P-38s approached Bougainville, the landscape changed. The endless ocean gave way to coastline, jungle, and the dangerous nearness of enemy territory. The American pilots had reached the place where the calculations either became history or embarrassment. They had flown hundreds of miles in silence for a target that might not be there. Then they saw the Japanese formation, 2 Betty bombers, 6 Zero fighters. Not one bomber, as some may have expected, but 2. That detail changed the situation instantly. The Americans could not be certain which Betty carried Yamamoto. The mission was not simply to attack a formation. It was to make sure the right man did not land. If there were 2 bombers, then both had to be treated as critical targets. The P-38s dropped their external tanks. The Lightnings began to climb and accelerate into the attack. This was the moment when 2 hours of silence became seconds of violence. The Zero escorts saw the P-38s and reacted. The Japanese pilots were not asleep, not helpless, not incompetent. They were escorting a valuable commander, and the sudden appearance of twin-boom American fighters meant the threat was immediate. The sky split into separate fights. Some P-38s climbed for cover. The attack section drove toward the bombers. The Zeros moved to intercept. The carefully planned mission became the one thing no plan can fully control a fight. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber were part of the attack section. Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine were also involved, but trouble struck again. One of the P-38s had difficulty releasing a fuel tank, and that problem delayed part of the attack. In a mission built around seconds, even a stubborn fuel tank could change history. Holmes and Hine were pulled out of the first rush toward the bombers, leaving Lanphier and Barber to press the attack under desperate conditions. The Japanese bombers dove toward the jungle, trying to escape low over the trees. That was their best chance. Low altitude could make pursuit harder, give the pilots cover from the terrain, and reduce the time available for the Americans to line up clean shots. But the P-38 was built for speed and firepower, and Barber pushed after the lead Betty. What happened in those next seconds would become one of the most debated air combat moments of the war. Lanphier later claimed a central role in shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft. Barber also claimed the kill, and later evidence would strongly support Barber's case, especially because Yamamoto's bomber appeared to have been hit from behind, matching Barber's attack angle. Official credit would eventually remain split between Lanphier and Barber, but the controversy did not end. Historians, veterans, investigators, and aviation researchers would argue the case for decades. But inside the battle, the pilots did not have decades. They had seconds. Barber closed on the Betty from behind and fired. The concentrated guns of the P-38 hammered into the bomber. The aircraft began to fail, dropping lower over the jungle. For the men in the American cockpits, there was no time to know with certainty who was inside. They knew only that this was one of the two bombers and that the mission required it to be brought down. The Betty carrying Yamamoto went into the jungle near Bougainville. There is no need to describe the end in graphic detail. The historical meaning is enough. The aircraft disappeared into the green canopy, and with it went the commander of the Japanese combined fleet, the man whose plans had helped bring the Pacific War into its most violent form. Yamamoto was gone. But the fight was not over. The second Betty was also attacked, and it went down into the sea. Admiral Motomi Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, was aboard that aircraft and survived, becoming one of the witnesses to the disaster. The Zero escorts continued to fight. The P-38s had to escape. One American pilot, Raymond Hine, did not return. His loss is sometimes overshadowed by the fame of the mission, but it should not be. Operation Vengeance succeeded, but it was not cost-free. One of the men who flew into that long silence over the Pacific did not come home. That is important because stories of successful missions can become too clean. The plan worked. The target was found. The admiral was killed. The aircraft returned. But inside that simple summary are human costs, fear, confusion, and uncertainty. Not every pilot saw the same thing. Not every claim matched later evidence. Not every aircraft returned safely. And not every man who took off from Guadalcanal lived to hear how history would remember the mission. This is where I want you to comment again. Who do you think deserves the center of this story? The codebreakers who found the schedule, Major Mitchell who planned and led the impossible flight, Rex Barber and the attack pilots who closed on the bombers, or the P-38 itself, the only fighter with the range to make the ambush possible? Write your answer below, because Operation Vengeance was not the work of one trigger pull. It was a chain, and every link had to hold. The return flight was another test. The P-38s had flown an extraordinary distance to reach the target. Now they had to get back. Combat burns fuel in ways careful cruise flight does not. Climbing, accelerating, maneuvering, and fighting all eat into the margins. A pilot could survive the interception and still be lost if the fuel gauges fell too fast. The same ocean that had hidden them on the way in now waited beneath them on the way home. The pilots who returned to Guadalcanal brought back more than a victory. They brought back a secret that had to be handled carefully, claims that had to be sorted out, and a mission so extraordinary that it almost immediately began turning into legend. The American command had succeeded in removing one of Japan's most important military leaders, but they also had to protect the fact that Yamamoto's itinerary had been obtained through code breaking. Public glory had to be balanced against intelligence security. That balance was not easy. Pilots talk, journalists ask questions, commanders write reports, rumors move faster than official silence. Eventually, details leaked into the press, and the operation became known far beyond the rooms where it had been planned. The secrecy around the code-breaking source remained vital, but the mission itself entered American wartime mythology. For the United States, the death of Yamamoto carried enormous emotional weight. This was the man associated with Pearl Harbor, the man many Americans viewed as the mind behind the attack that had pulled them fully into the war. His death felt like justice, revenge, and proof that the United States could reach deep into the Pacific and strike a target Japan believed was protected by distance. For Japan, the loss was severe. Yamamoto was not just another admiral. He was a symbol of naval competence and strategic imagination. His death hurt morale at a time when Japan could not afford another psychological blow. The news was not immediately announced to the Japanese public. When it finally came, it was treated with national seriousness because the loss was too large to hide forever. But we should be careful not to exaggerate the military effect. Operation Vengeance did not end the Pacific War. It did not collapse the Japanese Navy overnight. It did not suddenly make the island campaigns easy. Wars of this size are not decided by the death of one man, no matter how important he is. Japan still had commanders, ships, aircraft, soldiers, and a willingness to fight on. The mission mattered because it removed a highly respected leader, struck at Japanese morale, boosted American morale, and proved the reach of American intelligence and air power. It was not a magic blow. It was a precise blow. That is what makes it so fascinating. Operation Vengeance was not brute force. It was not hundreds of bombers flattening a target. It was not a fleet battle. It was a tiny moving point in the sky meeting another tiny moving point in the sky because codebreakers, planners, mechanics, pilots, and navigators made the impossible lineup. Think about the sequence. A Japanese message is sent. American listening stations intercepted. Codebreakers read it. Commanders understand the opportunity. Political and military leaders approve the risk. A mission is planned around range limits and fuel tanks. P-38s are selected because no other local fighter can do the job. Pilots fly low across hundreds of miles of ocean. They reach the interception point on time. Yamamoto is punctual. The Japanese formation appears. The attack section finds the bombers. The target is brought down. Each step could have failed. If the message had not been intercepted, there would be no mission. If the codebreakers had not decrypted it in time, there would be no mission. If commanders had refused to risk exposing the intelligence source, there would be no mission. If the P-38 lacked the range, there would be no mission. If Mitchell's navigation had been wrong, the aircraft would have found nothing. If Yamamoto had changed his schedule, the ambush would have missed. If the Zeros had reacted differently, the outcome might have changed. If fuel had run short, the price could have been far higher. This is why Operation Vengeance feels less like a normal air battle and more like a clockwork trap. The morality of the mission is also part of why it remains so compelling. In war, commanders send men to die every day, and opposing commanders are legitimate military targets. Yamamoto was not a civilian. He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, traveling through an active war zone on an inspection tour. By the logic of war, striking him was lawful and strategically understandable, but it still feels different because the mission was designed around one person. The Americans were not simply attacking an airfield or a convoy. They were hunting a named man. That gives Operation Vengeance a sharpness that ordinary combat narratives do not have. It raises questions that are still relevant today when intelligence can identify a specific commander. Does killing him shorten the war, or does it risk turning war into personal retaliation? Is it justice, strategy, revenge, or all three at once? The answer depends on where you stand. For American leaders in 1943, Yamamoto was a military commander whose removal could help the war effort and avenge Pearl Harbor. For Japanese officers, his death was a devastating ambush made possible by a secret they did not know they had lost. For the pilots, it was a mission of distance, timing, and danger. For historians, it is a case study in intelligence-driven warfare. For us, looking back, it is a story that refuses to be simple, and that is why it works so well. Because the best war stories are not only about what happened, they are about what the event reveals. Operation Vengeance reveals the growing power of signals intelligence. It reveals the importance of range in the Pacific. It reveals why the P-38 mattered. It reveals how one admiral's reputation could turn a single flight into a strategic opportunity. It reveals how revenge and military logic can become almost impossible to separate. The P-38 deserves special attention because without it, the decrypted itinerary would have been almost useless. Knowing where Yamamoto would be did not automatically give the Americans the ability to reach him. The Pacific is not a battlefield that forgives short-legged aircraft. Distance decides what is possible. The Lightning's twin engines and external tanks turned intelligence into action. That is a key lesson. Intelligence without reach is only knowledge. Reach without intelligence is only wandering. Operation Vengeance succeeded because both came together. The aircraft also shaped the battle itself. The P-38's speed, range, and nose-mounted guns made it ideal for a fast interception. The pilots did not need to walk machine gun fire in from wing convergence. They could aim the nose and deliver a concentrated burst. Against the lightly protected Betty bombers, that firepower was decisive. But the P-38 was not invulnerable. Flying so far over water created its own danger. Low-altitude navigation was exhausting. Mechanical failures could end the mission. Zero fighters could still kill an American pilot. Raymond Hines' loss reminds us that the Lightning did not make the mission safe. It made the mission possible. There is a difference. Possible still meant dangerous. Possible still meant one mistake could be fatal. Possible still meant the ocean was waiting all the way home. When the surviving pilots returned, the immediate question of success was clear. Yamamoto had been intercepted and his aircraft had gone down, but the question of credit became tangled. Lanphier claimed the kill, Barber claimed the kill, Holmes had engaged the second bomber. Initial reports were confused, partly because the pilots entered a fast, chaotic fight expecting one bomber and finding two. Later Japanese evidence and wreckage analysis complicated earlier claims. Officially, credit for Yamamoto's aircraft remained split between Lanphier and Barber, but many modern researchers argue that Barber's attack from behind best matches the physical evidence. This controversy can be tempting to turn into the whole story, but it should not consume the mission. It matters because truth matters, and because credit matters to pilots who risked everything. But Operation Vengeance was larger than one man's claim. It was a system of intelligence planning, aircraft performance, and execution. If we reduce it only to who pulled the trigger, we miss the larger achievement. The larger achievement was getting the right fighters to the right place at the right second without the enemy knowing they were coming. That is the real miracle of the mission. The death of Yamamoto did not stop the war, but it changed the emotional landscape. For Americans, it was proof that Pearl Harbor had not been forgotten. The man most associated with planning the attack had been reached in the skies of the South Pacific. For Japan, it was a warning that distance and secrecy were no longer enough. If the enemy could appear at the exact time and place of Yamamoto's flight, then something in the invisible war had gone terribly wrong. That invisible war may be the most important part of the story. The pilots became famous because they flew the mission, but the codebreakers made the mission possible. Men in rooms far from the dogfight had listened, intercepted, decrypted, translated, and interpreted. Their work had no engine noise, no gunfire, no dramatic dive toward jungle. But without them, the P-38s would never have known where to go. Modern war often works that way. The visible strike is only the final act of an invisible chain. The aircraft is what people remember, but behind it are signals, maps, analysts, maintenance crews, fuel handlers, commanders, and timing calculations. Operation Vengeance was an early and powerful example of what happens when intelligence and air power merge into one weapon. It was not just a hunt, it was a prediction made lethal. The Americans predicted where Yamamoto would be, then placed armed aircraft into that future before he arrived. That is why the mission feels so modern. Today, we are used to the idea that intelligence can find a person, track movement, and guide a strike. In 1943, Operation Vengeance showed how devastating that kind of warfare could be when combined with long-range aircraft and exact planning, but even the best prediction still needed men willing to fly it. The pilots of the P-38s had to trust calculations none of them could personally verify in the moment. Over the water, they could not see the target. They could not know if Yamamoto had taken off late, early, or at all. They could not know whether the Japanese had changed plans. They could only fly the heading, hold the silence, protect their fuel, and wait for the coast of Bougainville to prove whether the plan was genius or fantasy. That kind of trust is hard to dramatize because it is quiet, but it is as tense as any gunfight. A cockpit at low altitude over the Pacific with no radio chatter, no visible enemy, and no guarantee the target exists is its own kind of battlefield. The pilot fights doubt. He fights fatigue. He fights the instinct to climb where flying feels safer. He fights the temptation to ask questions. He fights the awareness that if the mission fails, the entire flight may have risked death for nothing. Then the target appears, and doubt turns instantly into action. That transition is the heart of Operation Vengeance. From silence to violence, from calculation to contact, from intelligence report to aircraft in the gun sight. And once the battle ended, the silence returned. But now it was heavier. One American pilot was missing. Yamamoto was dead. The survivors had to fly back with fuel margins, combat stress, and the knowledge that they had just changed the war in a way they could not fully discuss. They had completed one of the most daring fighter interceptions in history, but secrecy wrapped around the victory almost immediately. That secrecy also protected the codebreakers. If Japan had fully understood how the ambush was arranged, it could have changed codes and procedures sooner, possibly affecting later operations. So even triumph had to be restrained. The mission succeeded, partly because it emerged from secrecy, and its full meaning had to remain hidden for security. Near the end of this story, I want you to write one more comment if you were in command and had the chance to remove Yamamoto, but doing so risked revealing that your codebreakers could read Japanese messages. Would you approve the mission? Yes or no? And explain why. Because that decision is the real pressure point of Operation Vengeance. It was not only a pilot's risk, it was an intelligence gamble. The American leadership decided the opportunity was worth it. That decision still echoes because it shows how war forces commanders to spend secrets like ammunition. A code-breaking advantage can be more valuable than a battleship. Use it too often or too obviously, and the enemy may discover it. Keep it hidden too carefully, and chances to save lives or strike critical targets may disappear. Operation Vengeance was one of those moments when the secret was judged valuable enough to risk because the target was Yamamoto. In the end, the mission worked because Yamamoto's strengths became vulnerabilities. His punctuality, normally a mark of discipline, made him predictable. His morale tour, meant to strengthen Japanese forces, put him in the air near the front. His importance, which justified the escort, also justified the American risk. The same qualities that made him valuable made him targetable. That is the cold logic of war. The more important a commander becomes, the more his movements matter. The more his movements matter, the more dangerous it becomes for the enemy to know them. Yamamoto understood risk. He had warned about war with America. He knew the vast industrial power Japan had awakened. He had planned bold operations and seen some of them succeed brilliantly, while others, like Midway, ended in disaster. By April of 1943, he was flying through a Pacific that had changed since Pearl Harbor. Japan was no longer only advancing. It was being pushed, bled, and studied by an enemy learning quickly. Operation Vengeance was part of that learning process. The United States had absorbed the shock of Pearl Harbor, survived early defeats, fought through Guadalcanal, expanded its air and naval power, and built an intelligence machine capable of turning enemy messages into operational strikes. Yamamoto had helped begin the Pacific War with a surprise attack. He died because the Americans created a surprise of their own. That symmetry is why the story has such force. Pearl Harbor was an attack built on secrecy, timing, distance, and carrier aviation. Operation Vengeance was an answer built on secrecy, timing, distance, and fighter aviation, not equal in scale, not equal in destruction, but connected by the same elements of modern war. The final meaning of Operation Vengeance depends on how you view war itself. If you see war as a contest of commanders, then the mission was the removal of a brilliant enemy leader. If you see war as a contest of systems, then it was proof that American intelligence, planning, and aircraft range had matured into a deadly combination. If you see war as a moral tragedy, then it was another example of how human beings become targets on maps, schedules, and intercepted messages. If you see it as justice, then it was the long shadow of Pearl Harbor finally reaching one of the men responsible. Maybe it was all of these. That is why the story should not be told as a simple revenge fantasy. Revenge was part of the emotion, but the operation was more than emotion. It was military logic executed with extraordinary precision. Yamamoto was not targeted because of anger alone. He was targeted because he was a senior commander whose loss would matter. The fact that he was also the architect of Pearl Harbor gave the mission its name, its fire, and its place in memory. Operation Vengeance succeeded because the Americans did not let anger replace planning. They turned anger into mathematics. That is the line that defines the mission, not rage in the sky. Mathematics in service of revenge, a decrypted message, a calculated route, a fuel plan, a low-altitude approach, a silent formation, a timed interception, a sudden climb, a short fight, a long return. The entire operation was a blade sharpened by numbers, and when the blade struck, it struck exactly where it was aimed. Years later, people would still argue about the credit, still study the wreckage, still examine pilot accounts, still ask whether Barber deserved sole recognition, whether Lanfear's claim held up, and how official records should have handled the evidence. Those debates matter, but they exist because the mission itself mattered. Nobody argues for decades over a routine interception. Operation Vengeance became controversial because it became legendary, and legends survive because they contain tension. This one contains many tensions: secrecy and publicity, justice and revenge, individual credit and collective effort, precision and chaos, intelligence rooms and fighter cockpits, the death of one man and the movement of an entire war. The P-38s that morning were not just aircraft. They were the final visible form of an invisible decision. By the time their guns fired over Bougainville, the mission had already passed through code rooms, command debates, maintenance work, navigation planning, and the silent discipline of the long ocean flight. The bullets were the last step, not the first. That is what makes the story so powerful for aviation history. Aircraft are often remembered for speed, weapons, and design. But Operation Vengeance shows that an aircraft's greatest power may come from being in the right place at the right time, because an entire system made that possible. The P-38 did not win the war alone. It did something more precise. It gave American intelligence the reach to become action. And on April 18, 1943, that reach extended all the way to Yamamoto. The final image should not be only the crash site in the jungle or the returning P-38s at Guadalcanal. The final image should be the moment before contact, when the American pilots had not yet seen the target. They had flown for hours in silence, low over the Pacific, trusting a decrypted message and a set of calculations. Ahead of them was either history or empty sky. Behind them was too much ocean to make failure comfortable. Then the Japanese formation appeared. At that instant, every hidden part of the mission became real. The codebreakers were right. The planners were right. The aircraft had the range. The pilots had held the course. Yamamoto was on time. And the Pacific, for once, gave both hunter and target the same patch of sky. If this story changed how you see Operation Vengeance, subscribe to Wings of War and leave your answer in the comments. Was this mission justice, revenge, strategy, or all three? And who deserves the center of the legend, the codebreakers, Major Mitchell, Rex Barber, the P-38 pilots, or the Lightning itself? Because some air battles are won by speed and some are won by firepower. But Operation Vengeance was won before the first shot was fired, in the invisible space where intelligence, timing, fuel, and courage came together. 18 fighters took off across the Pacific to find one man in the sky. They had no room for error, no time to spare, and no guarantee the target would appear. But he did. And when the P-38s climbed out of the waves over Bougainville, the architect of Pearl Harbor had only seconds left in the air.